The Revenge of the Wizard's Ghost by John Bellairs, Chapter 13. For 10 terrifying seconds, Fergie and the Professor waited. Then the shaking stopped and the noise died away to a distant grumbling. "My stars!" gasped the Professor. "What was that?" "You got me," said Fergie. He leaned out over the edge of the scaffold and pointed the beam of the searchlight down and onto the ladder. "I don't know what that was, but you better climb up here so we can get what we came after and then clear out. Come on, Professor, hurry!" For a second more, the Professor hesitated. Was it right for him to risk his life and Fergie's in a building that might come down on their heads at any minute? But they were so close to the end of their search, so very, very close. "Hang on, Byron," the Professor called. "I'll be up in a jiffy." A few minutes later, the Professor was squatting on the end of the scaffold with Fergie. In his hands, he clutched a broom, and as Fergie held the searchlight steady, he began to prod at the shield with the handle. Now that they could see it up close, Fergie and the Professor realized the shield was not painted on the stone. It was a piece of metal held in place by bolts. As the Professor prodded, the shield made a tinny wanging sound. "What are you trying to do?" asked Fergie. "I'm trying to loosen this piece of tin, if I can," muttered the Professor as he lunged again with the broomstick. "It would help if the scaffold were closer to our target, but it isn't." After a few more blows, the Professor paused and squinted at the shield. "Drat!" he growled. "We haven't done a thing to it except dent it a little." The Professor paused. The corner of his mouth was twitching, and he seemed to be thinking. "Byron!" he snapped suddenly. "Is there a screwdriver in that tool bag of yours?" Fergie unzipped the bag and fumbled around inside with his hand. "Yeah, here it is," he said at last, holding up a long screwdriver with a clipped red wooden handle. "Thank you," said the Professor. "That will do nicely. Hang on to it a minute, will you?" As Fergie waited, the Professor laid the broom down on the scaffold. He took off one of his sneakers and pulled the shoelace out of it. After showing Fergie where to point the light, he took the screwdriver from him and began to bind it to the broom handle. "Good and tight," grunted the Professor as he worked. "I learned to rap and frap in the army many years ago, and I still know how it seems." Finally, he stopped and held the broomstick up. The screwdriver was bound tightly to the end, like the point on some caveman's spear. "All righty now," said the Professor as he grasped the broom handle in both hands. "If you will point the beam up there, so, Byron. Ah, perfect. Now, let's see what we can do." There was a thin black line between the edge of the shield and the stone. Was it a space that could be widened? The Professor meant to find out. Carefully, he slid the tip of the screwdriver into the dark crack and began to pry. Squeak! The gap widened, and a metal bolt fell out. They heard it hit the floor below with a tiny ping, but the strain of prying had knocked the screwdriver askew, and the Professor had to haul it back, lay it on the boards, and refasten it. He fussed and fumed as he retied the shoelace. Ah! It was tight again. With a triumphant growl, the Professor raised the stick and went to work on the shield. The shadowy gap was wider. In went the point and the shank of the screwdriver, all the way up to the handle. The Professor pried outward with the broom handle, and they heard a quick sliding noise. Something had been sitting on the underside of the shield, and now it zipped out with a talk. It hit the pavement stones below. "Ha!" exclaimed the Professor as he glanced into the darkness. "We've got the prize in the cereal box, whatever on earth it may be. Point your light down there, Byron, and no, on second thought, forget it. Let's just climb down and glom the thing and get out of..." The rumbling started again, and the scaffold jerked back and forth as if a giant were shaking it. Panicked, the Professor pitched the broom handle over the end of the scaffold and started shuffling on his knees toward the ladder. As Fergie tried to hold the light steady, the Professor started down. The rumbling grew louder, and the scaffold vibrated. Its steel legs danced and chattered on the pavement, and the Professor had to cling tightly to the rungs of the ladder to keep from being pitched onto the floor below. A short way from the broom, he jumped and landed on his feet. "Throw me the light, Byron," he yelled in a panicky voice. "I'll hold it for you so you can climb." But Fergie was already on his way down, with the handle of the searchlight clenched in his teeth. As soon as he got to the bottom, he took the light in his hands and waved the beam on the floor. There it was, a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. "I'll get it!" roared the Professor, and he lunged forward, dropped to his knees, and scooped up the package. The floor of the church began to heave and pitch like the deck of a ship in a storm. The Professor staggered to his feet and reeled sideways as another shock hit. At the other end of the church, things were crashing. It sounded as if parts of the ceiling and walls were coming down. "Oh, good Lord! Oh, good heavens!" babbled the professor as he glanced wildly around. "We've got to get out! Come on, follow me!" The professor dashed down the length of the church, and Fergie ran after him. The steady rumbling went on, broken now and then by crashes. The professor really did not know where he was going, but he raced on in a blind panic, hoping that a door would appear. They had come to an open space lit faintly by moonlight. It was the well underneath the cement tower, and if they had turned to their left, they could have gotten out through the door they had entered by. But the professor was not thinking clearly, and neither was Fergie. Together they galloped off into the shadows, and Fergie, wildly swinging the light, picked out a narrow, pointed door. "There!" yelled the professor. "Out through there! Come on!" He rushed at the door and opened it, and now the two of them were climbing single file up a narrow spiral staircase. Up and up it wound. The walls vibrated and hummed, and bits of mortar dust sifted down onto their heads. Still they climbed. Finally they came to a little hallway with two narrow windows set in one wall. The bottom of each window was about chest-high to Fergie. It would not be hard to climb out of it. However, there were lots of little square panes of glass set in strips of lead. "Bash it!" screeched the professor, gesturing wildly toward one of the windows. "Use the searchlight! Go on! What are you waiting for?" Fergie hesitated a second, and then he swung the heavy lamp. Glass crunched, and the lead strips bent. Again and again Fergie swung the light, and each time more glass broke. Standing on tiptoe, he reached up, and with his elbow smashed out the twisted strips of lead. There was a ragged hole now in the bottom part of the window. I think we can get out now," Fergie gasped, wiping his hand across his sweaty face. "Here, take this." He shoved the searchlight at the professor. Amazingly, it was still working. Clutching the light in one hand and the package in the other, the professor watched as Fergie scrambled up into the window opening. Poking his head out, Fergie took a look around. By the light of the full moon, he saw a slant